So I'm going to read a little bit. I'm still pretty new at reading from and talking about this book, and it turns out it's sort of an awkward book to both read from and talk about. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the middle that sort of is about, well, you'll see, and then sort of a tiny little bit from the end of the book. And then Kristen and I will talk, and then we'll have cake. Oh, and a little context, I guess. So Captive Audience is about reality TV and watching reality TV, and then it's also talking about watching reality TV with my wife and sort of the way that you sort of spend your life watching TV and the weird levels of intimacy and performance that are present. Okay, and so and so it sort of bounces around between personal stuff and then journalistic stuff and then what end up just sort of being like very detailed descriptions of reality television show plots. And so hopefully this will cover a little bit of all of that. Robert Galinski makes characters for a living. People come to him as themselves, leave as something a little more. Galinski invented and still runs the New York City Reality Television School, the first and only of its kind, preparing hopefuls for their cattle calls like a Lee Strasberg reconceived for 21st century ambitions. When I meet him, he's guarded. The only press coverage he's ever gotten has been brutal. But after I tell him sincerely that I find his critics to be pearl clutchers, he becomes animated and jumps right into telling me about one of his best students. There was this girl I had come in, he tells me. She walked with a cane and she had a service dog. I asked her, "Who are you?" She said, "I'm the girl who has a prescription pill addiction because I'm mentally ill." She asked me if that was okay, and I asked her if she was okay with it. And she said, "Oh yeah, it's true. That's what I'm bringing to the table." And so we went with that. Galinski finishes his anecdote with a proud shrug and leans back into a leather couch. We're in a coffee shop in Alphabet City that seems to serve as his home base. He comes out of experimental theater and improv, speaks in those terms, wears jeans with flip-flops and red sunglasses that are a bit of a personal trademark. The barista kids know he always orders a macchiato. For a long time, he was just an improv coach. He started teaching reality when an Argentinian dog groomer called the number on his website and said he had a month to prepare for an audition for a show that would end up being called Groomer Has It. Galinski lets that name hang out there like I'll recognize it. Remarkably, I don't, but no matter. If I'd seen the show, I would have seen Jorge become the star. Out of all the groomers, it was Jorge whom everyone wished good things for. He played the whole damn season in hero position, just like an improv game, the way Galinski taught him to, and he killed it. He didn't win the show, but he won affection. He proved to be watchable, and after his season, he landed a role on TLC's Extreme Poodles. That's true. He was never the guy who threw the glass at the wall, Galinski tells me. He was the guy who went up to the glass thrower and said, "Don't do that. Why'd you have to do that? What are you feeling that made you do that?" Galinski figured out pretty fast that the same principles he'd always taught improvers applied to reality shows, that willingness to constantly stoke the story forward, that in-the-moment fearlessness, sustained commitment above all else. A common misconception among people who deride reality performers, he tells me, is that nobody's interested in the ones who don't get into fights, that they provide no intrigue. The truth is, and any seasoned on-the-fly performer knows this, if you jump into the middle of the fight to break it up, you become a hero. Or you become someone trying to be a hero, and as long as it seems genuine, everyone wants to see someone try to be that. I agree with this, and then we both try to come up with that F. Scott Fitzgerald quote about heroes, but we can't quite remember it, so we go back to TV and what makes for a great performance of self. We speak of Rodney King breaking down on Celebrity Rehab, Galinski's favorite of the shows, and that guy from Taxi, and that drummer from that grunge band. They were so fucked up, these men. They were so pained, and they had been pained for so long, telling the story of their pain like every day of their lives had been an audition for the moment that they could finally be that pained for an audience. I don't know if you should exactly call it talent, Galinski says, but yeah, it always helps if they've got some really fucked up lived material to draw upon. That's a scab that he can pick at, help turn into the blood that an audience tunes in for. We're back to his pill-addicted, cane-using pupil. I asked Galinski why she wanted that to be who she was on a television show, and did it work? Galinski can't remember, but he's pretty sure she hasn't made it onto whatever show she wanted to get on. Doesn't matter. Those producers must be insane, he says. And the important thing anyways is that she went into her audition clear-eyed and armored. She would be an active storyteller. She would be the one valuing her trauma, valuing it enough to lead with it, as opposed to letting some producer ferret it out and then define her with it. I ask Galinski if he's proud of that anecdote. It's a leading question and gets the expected answer. He helped, in his own way and in his own view, to give this woman some combination of the three qualities that any teacher wants to provide to their students: authenticity, confidence, power. He tells me he teaches 2 classes at Rikers Island, and he tries to provide the soon-to-be paroled with the same qualities as the soon-to-be on TV. We sit silent for a moment, and I consider the 2 neat though flawed parallels he set up: reality performer as prisoner, reality show as the world, which makes him some combination of shrink, parole officer, and career counselor. This all smacks of new agey self-empowerment in a way that would ordinarily make me uncomfortable. It still does a little as we sit in the kind of coffee shop that guys like us sit in, drinking our macchiatos and sneering about shows like CSI because they have no life, no guts to them. Guts, we agree, come from people like Galinski's pill-addicted, cane-using student. He prodded her to reveal to a circle of fellow wannabe stars in class the tagline that she would put on her life, and regardless of its manufacturedness, it worked because it was nakedly pained, because it made you worry for her or tisk at her. And this exercise prepared her to repeat that story in an audition, to repeat that story as the official one, recorded, hopefully broadcast and commodified. If she wanted to be that brave, Galinski says, and he leans forward on brave like he really means it, if she wanted to be that brave, then good. She was ready to tell her story. Brave is a tough word to accept, I think, and bravery a tough concept. The lines between bravery and arrogance or ignorance or stupidity or worse, desperation. Sometimes it's hard to trust that those lines are there. But what else to call such an act? To put a name on yourself that marks you a freak or an asshole or a reclamation project, and then to step in front of a blinking red light, open source material for the Frankenbiters to do with what they will. That's a term for reality producers among some people. Maybe I'm using bravery to describe what is really the internal calculation of how much attention one wants or sometimes believes that they need, and how much one is willing to risk to be seen. But I want to be seen, to be known somehow. I've dreamed of it, and I've never risked anything like that. And so that act of risk makes this woman at least a little extra deserving of whatever it is she wants. And whatever she wants seems less important in the face of what she'll do in the service of the wanting. It's not the car wreck that people are looking for, Galinski says, and I'll admit this sounds a little rehearsed. It's that moment when the car wreck is inevitable and we're wondering if someone will survive. So the camera turns on, crash, and then. Ask me for a tragedy and I'll point you to Rob Kardashian. I can't imagine it's easy to be younger brother to Kourtney, Kim, and Khloe, older brother to Kendall and Kylie, each one's... I've never read that part out loud before. Each one so forceful and beautiful and impervious to wilting. Even in the earlier days, the happy times, Rob always stayed at the edges of the screen, darting into scenes as a gentle foil or affable peacemaker. He operated as a sort of cipher for vaguely appealing normalness, often doofy and jovial, occasionally pouty, typically vain, always incompetent but sincere. I'm not the first person to argue this, but to say that the Kardashians' success is superficial is a disservice. They elevate superficiality. They are so good at it, so committed, so fully and captivatingly bared, so productive. They make no effort to make it look easy. It can become exhausting to tune into. Not Rob. Rob is attrition and apathy. Rob is trapped in the way that most compelling characters are trapped, in the way that I often feel trapped. Rob changes in directions that he does not want to change, and all of it is seen. Let me just admit this right away. I like to Google fat Rob Kardashian to look at the image results. You know this. I think you do it too. There are many results. If you wanted to, and I think someone should, you could make a collage of these images that runs around all the walls of a giant gallery space, tens of thousands of images with no break in between, many of them almost the same, but not quite. It would be as though he were never not viewed, like a flipbook of a life spent flaunting and hiding himself at the exact same time, his eyes always peering out from under a baseball cap to see who is looking, and it's hard to tell whether he's checking to see if he's safely alone or checking to make sure that someone still cares to watch. Many of the pictures come spliced next to his early shots, the ones where he's shirtless and celebrating something insignificant in a horizon pool, tattoos dotting his muscled side abs like gum splotches on a cobblestone street. And then, there is narrative just in this juxtaposition, a tragedy because look, he used to be one way, and look, now he's another, and look, it's still happening, and we get to watch him face it. I love to watch him face it. I think Rob and I are the same age. That must have something to do with it. He has been on television as himself for the exact span of time that I have loved you, and I have so badly wanted you to see me as the narrow, nubile, carefree kind of beautiful that he used to be. He used to cavort in his shots. That's the best word for it. We used to watch him just sort of hang around the family mansion, 23 and still living at home, eating a banana or drinking a beer, winking at the camera in a way that read less obnoxiously cool, more endearingly incompetent. He always seemed a bit adrift, a bit bored, and I took comfort in seeing somebody enact this condition successfully, one that I felt but could never accurately convey. He seemed not performatively ecstatic, just happy enough. Happy in a way that is unnoticeable unless someone is really watching, and of course we were always really watching, and there was that pleasure in seeing him exist as the least remarkable person in the room. Now when we watch him, we see the way he tries to hide his enlarged self, see his family speak about him in whispers, with cruel worry. We talk about how long ago it was that Rob cavorted, and it always feels at least a little bit profound to point out the way time passes, how ominous that can be. We were still living in Iowa the first time Rob broke down in a scene that had clearly been orchestrated for a breakdown. Family therapy, held in what looked to be a vintage furniture showroom, complete with ornate velvet couches and fur blankets draped over mid-century chairs. Rob had on a black baseball cap, as would become the norm, presumably to hide the creeping baldness, and an oversized black hoodie to hide everything else. He grew increasingly upset at accusations flying his way. He began to tear up as the therapist coaxed him. "You look sad. Am I misreading you?" Then fled to the bathroom. His mother and two of his sisters, immaculate in dress and posture, stayed on the couch stoic. Another sister and the therapist, and I would guess 2 or 3 cameras, followed him. The bathroom wasn't huge, so he was trapped, and the cameras were tight on him. The shot stayed mostly on him in profile, newly expanding torso heaving, the lightly stubbled beginnings of a double chin accordioning as he cried. He held a hand towel over his face, and there was that drama of watching someone so closely as they show you how little they want to be watched. "All I care about is like saying yes to my mom and making her happy," he said, trapped in there. He looked up. "And doing whatever my sisters want to make them happy. And when it comes to the easiest things, they won't help me." Here he buried his head back in the towel and squeaky cried. The therapist's bony hand was on his ample shoulder. She was kneading him, and her enormous pewter bracelet shone in the lighting. In an on-the-fly cutaway to his mother and sisters sitting without him, his mother, stone-faced, said, "I like it when he's vulnerable because I think he needs to break those walls down. He's so angry." Watching it, I was struck by how much she genuinely seemed to think that she was caring for him, and also how much she was consciously writing him into this sad, angry man-boy, handing him over to viewers as such. Of course, the next shot was back to Rob, trying to articulate that there are so many things that he wants to do, successes that he should have, that dress sock company that showed such promise, and if his father was alive, his father might understand a little better. The therapist brushed that away, called it a top-layer issue, told him that he had spent too much time running from his feelings, from his very self. "You're one of those steam kettles, Robert," she said. "You know, sitting on the stove on the fire. You're so full of feeling." Then on cue, he boiled, the squeaking louder, the wheezing breaths more frequent, burying his face again. I realized that the editors had never fully cut out the transition music, just lowered it, so there was a thumping, somber hip-hop beat carrying through the moment, like we were in an old ship's furnace, and the panic and the inevitability were all heightened that much more. "I've got you," the therapist said, which again towed a line between caring, commanding, and threatening. "Come on, let me see your face." Rob obliged, moved the towel, and face exposed, camera creeping even closer, said, "Nothing matters. Nothing's going to change." There was one perfect beat extra, and then a cut. One last little Rob thing. On the Kardashian shows for a long time, Rob has been mostly an absence, though a fraught one. His mother says, maybe I spoiled him and that's why he's like this, but he's my son. His sister says, I'm not saying he's not in pain. I'm just saying he could learn to take a little responsibility. He could do something about it. His other sister says, I showed up at the condo to take him to the gym with me and he doesn't even fucking come out. Like I'm an adult. I've got things to do. Where is Rob? What is he doing? What is he eating? Is the room dark? Has he painted all the mirrors black? Will he be okay? Can anybody save him? I'm not going to pretend I don't sometimes ask, am I as fat as Rob Kardashian? I ask so that you'll say no. There was a time when I asked you and you said no, but the honest answer would have been, it's a toss-up. I still like that the great tribulation of his storyline is as petty as mine, but that on screen it can seem seismic, and that seismicity feels like an accurate reflection of the way I experience it. Still he returns, and you and I watch him with a gleeful memory of all the times he looked like he wanted to escape. Last season, Rob apparently didn't want to be on the show at all, but there he was. He appeared only sporadically, but he was there, sitting silent on the couch as the rest of the family continued at their normal volume. We smiled at each other. Of course he's back. I remember one scene when Courtney, Chloe, and Scott were arguing playfully on the couch next to him about something that didn't matter. They were giggling and tugging on one another, and then Courtney, the littlest, was draped across the rest of them, her sister slapping her ass, camera focused on her exposed thong. Their self-satisfaction was extra gratuitous, but also extra appealing next to Rob, who, as usual, embodied the way I have so often felt, perfectly still, aware of every inch of space he took up on that piece of furniture. It ain't over till the fat lady sings, Scott yelled. Chloe, start singing, Courtney said, and everyone laughed in that exact way that people laugh when there is nothing of them in the punchline. And then there was Rob at the edge of the shot. Rob leaning away but letting his eyes turn back to his sisters, as though waiting for one of them to notice, hiding, exposed. I'm going to read a tiny bit more. Thanks. This part is different and doesn't have to do with Rob Kardashian. So when you spend years writing a book about reality TV, and then in the course of like finishing that book and selling it, Donald Trump becomes president. It's a thing, you know, that you have to reckon with. And so this book is not really about Trump, but there is sort of stuff at the end in thinking about his presence, I guess, sort of heightening a lot of the anxieties around this kind of entertainment in general. And I was sort of interested in this idea of sort of the pleasure that you can feel from intimacy in terms of sort of tuning into what you want to tune into and caring about these things that are important to you in your life, or also what you watch, and then how that sort of volume relates to like the world and to politics and to trying to sort of, you know, be connected to the world. So this is like the closest thing that I can come to like an afterword. This is sort of my version of an afterword, but it's just a tiny little section of that actually doesn't mention him at all. Okay. All I have wanted to do lately is look at you. It feels good to do that. Good because I know your face so well, and your body, and how each contorts with a different type of movement or mood, and how that feels like frankness, honesty, since I know it well enough to trust what I'm seeing and its beauty. Solmaz Sharif's incredible poem, Look, begins like this. It matters what you call a thing. It's a poem about pain and bigotry and terror and the danger of America acting upon the poet's Iranian-American body without looking, or looking at her body without seeing her. She traces the 16 seconds that it might take between a button pressed in Las Vegas and a Hellfire missile hitting Mazar-e-Sharif, how casually and quietly our nation can kill a type of person we've decided to name an enemy. Then she ends with this: let it matter what we call a thing. Let it be the exquisite face for at least 16 seconds. Let me look at you. Let me look at you in a light that takes years to get here. I had forgotten about that poem until I read it in a coffee shop while trying to write about reality television. I was having a hard time focusing, and I was on Twitter, and I was scrolling and glancing and occasionally reading, and then Gia Tolentino, a writer I really admire, said that this was the poem that kept her sane in these times, and I wanted to be attached to her attempt, her wisdom, so I read the poem. And I was so moved. I am so moved writing this. Tears on my fucking keyboard and all that. Literal tears, no metaphor. Look, I want to. Look. When I see that word repeated, an invitation, a command, I want to be near you so I can look at you. Maybe that's all I'm crying for. Or worse, maybe I'm crying about the idea of myself looking at you, about the absolving power of intimacy, context fading like fog and wind, even as the poem demands that context be unavoidable. I do believe that the personal is always political, and even if I sometimes waver in that belief, I trumpet it loudly enough to my students that I start believing again. After the election, I handed out photocopies of Arendt's On Refugees, Orwell's Why I Write, held them up as cajoling proof of the power and responsibility of a personal story in a dangerous world. Now I hear myself so often in class demanding the acknowledgement that the personal and political must run hand in hand. But usually my students' responses suggest that the political is a burden to their personal narratives, as opposed to an opportunity. The political doesn't deepen what they want to say. It corrals it. It diffuses or defuses. When my students write about love, they want it to be about just that, on the nose, love, and that should be enough. Or loss, just loss, the only story to tell. Or pain, or rage, or triumph. And sometimes that's frustrating. And I know teachers who consider it their jobs to make a student leave their class with some diminished sense of their own importance in the face of the adult world. But sometimes I think, how can anything feel larger than their own feelings, their own heartbreaks? And in that way, what is intimate, what is entirely theirs to feel, blocks out everything. It's the shadow of an eclipse edging its way across a sun that is every important thing that is happening to and for and with everyone else in the world. All the rest is too bright to look at head on anyway. And I see myself in them, of course. I return to myself and the poem and the command to look, and I think that I am looking, but when I think of the power of looking, there I am looking at you, and then looking at the idea of myself looking at you. The exquisite face for 16 seconds, a light that takes years to get here. It is so much more than two faces pressed close, love-lit, staring, but it's also that. And there is the shadow of an eclipse edging across the sun. Thank you.
Let's talk about reality TV, and then I want to talk sort of more broadly about you as a writer and your career.
Okay, cool. Right? Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that I think is really interesting about this book is sort of, you talk a lot about the, is it not on? Just talking to it. Like this? Okay. So you talk a lot about the actual and the actual-ish, which I feel like is a really good entrance point into this book. Can you talk more about that now?
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things of writing about reality TV is that you're sort of, or thinking about reality TV is that you're automatically in sort of a conversation about veracity in some way. And this sense of what you're deciding to believe, what feels real, and then what feels authentic, and how those two things are different, and then like how you as the audience member negotiate it. And I think one of the things that is maybe a misconception about reality is when it's written off as sort of passive entertainment, where it's just sort of like, oh, well, this is bullshit, so you're either dumb and you believe it, or it's bullshit and it means nothing to you. But a lot of the sort of scholars that write about it, the most interesting takes seem to be that it lives in this gray area, right? That it is a kind of entertainment that demands an active negotiation, both from the people involved in making it and then also the people watching it, in terms of what do you really mean, right? Like how actual or how actual-ish is that? Or how are you finding something that feels in a particular moment authentically, emotionally real and resonant, despite it being absolutely surrounded by things that are made to look so absurdly bullshitty. And I don't think that these shows, especially at this point now that the form is so like mature, I don't think that any of these shows are out there like trying to pull the wool over everyone's eye. Like part of the thing is that you have to deal with where character begins and where honesty ends. And I think that that negotiation and sort of the weirdness of that dynamic is part of what makes reality TV so easy to get angry at and so easy to write off. And for me, you know, doing the kind of writing that we do and we've done, it's not the same thing, but it feels like that's sort of a similar conversation around trying to write non-fictionally or trying to write about your own life in the sense of where you begin and where the persona on the page begins and what the reader is supposed to expect from you or what you're supposed to expect the reader to want from you. So I do think, and I didn't really want that to sort of be like literally the book, but I do think that part of what was interesting to me was the ways that actualishness felt like something that really resonated with me from the work that I've done.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously always been a cultural condemnation of television, probably less so now that everyone's really into this idea of the TV as the new novel, blah, blah, blah. But, like reality TV is certainly at the bottom then of that, like it's the most condemned of the condemned. Like even among your students who like can like write off Kim Kardashian, but then they like love Twilight.
Yeah.
There's like this, somehow that is more of like an art form to them.
Yeah, that's something that I think one of the things that I didn't realize this going into it, but as I was writing, I realized that one of the things that's most exciting to me about it, or that made it interesting to think about, is that in a moment that, and I think this is a good thing, where like people are saying like the idea of low culture is bullshit, the idea of there being different varied types of culture is bullshit, right? So like that pop song is the most important political thing in the world, or like, that Netflix sitcom is somehow like telling us about who we are, right? Like everything is allowed to become meaningful and highbrow, and I think that that's good and that's fine. But when you're talking about reality TV, you're talking about the only form that hasn't happened for, to my understanding. Like it's the only thing where there has been no gesture towards people trying to talk about it with the generosity with which we're like willing to give fucking Chipotle commercials at this point, And so I'm not saying that it necessarily deserves that, but I'm saying that it makes it a really unique interaction, because it's like the term guilty pleasure is really overused, and at this point, most of people talking about guilty pleasure is being like, I'm not guilty. But I think reality TV is the thing that remains, that like really like that guilt and that shame and that sense of like, what is this? Why am I watching this? This is a waste of time. People tell me this is a waste of time. You actively have to be thinking about that when you're watching it or when you're engaging with it. And I don't think that really exists for anything else anymore. So I think it makes it kind of a sort of potent thing to deal with or think about.
Yeah, I mean, you have the great quote in your book from the New York Times article about the Jersey Shore the day after it premiered, where they basically said like, this is the end of the world. When we look back and try to determine how a great culture fell so far so fast. Yeah, it was like,
we will only
we'll
stop here.
Yeah. It's interesting though. I spend a lot of time in Las Vegas for work, and I feel like the relationship to reality TV there is totally different than in New York. Like you can still, everyone still wants to stay in the Real World suite. Like yeah. I was thinking actually when you come out, I was going to try to get it for you.
I would love to do that.
It's like preposterously expensive. And then the donut shop that I go to in the morning, like was on that show Tanked, which is apparently a show where they build fish tanks. And there's one that's like has donuts in it there, but it's like in the window, and like everyone goes there for that reason. And I don't necessarily know what that, I mean, certainly like there's all of these cliches about Vegas, but it seems to me like certain points of culture have like anointed it as okay, and others have,
Yeah, I think that's probably true, but I also think that even anywhere there's like a weird thing where people feel like a localized pride around things. Like I did an interview with a NPR show out of Madison last week, and like the producer that I was talking to randomly at one point was like, okay, so I don't really like these shows, but somebody who did like really well on The Bachelorette last season is from Madison, and like it's like a cool thing to be like, are you going to see them at the grocery store, right? So there is like I mean, you like sort of simultaneously write it off, but then like you walk by a restaurant in New York and it's like, oh, that person came in 5th on Chopped. It says so on the board. You know what I mean? Like there is this weird, people let themselves get excited about like one thing, like you sort of give yourself over to it, and then you're like, but not the rest of it, right.
So is the reality TV star a totally new, like 21st century celebrity? Like what was the 1950s version of like Kim Kardashian?
I don't really know. One of the sort of scholars that I talked to for the book is this guy, Mark Andreevich, and he was sort of saying that the way that we talk about somebody like Kim Kardashian is the exact way that people have talked about celebrities always, and that was always sort of tabloid culture. They just, in his reading, right, they used to have to do something first before we could be like, now I want to know what they wear. And so that the conversation about reality stars isn't necessarily any different than celebrity conversations have been before. It's just that like the middleman of like doing something else was cut out, right? It's just like you're purely interested in the idea of them, of you knowing who they are and them living their lives and you being curious about it, and the pretense of I'm curious about their lives because, you know, they're Greta Garbo, is taken out of the equation. And so I do think that that's a particularly 21st century, not entirely, but pretty much turn of the 21st century. And interestingly, like now has kind of been eclipsed. Like the idea of the reality star is in a lot of ways sort of like a weird nostalgic thing. Like they have been sort of replaced by YouTube stars and Instagram celebrities, and sort of the way that those two things bleed into each other. And also the way that I think reality TV is like scrambling to try to understand what its role in this whole ecosystem is, I think is really interesting.
Yeah. You know, I feel like the book is a really nostalgic book. I feel like kind of all of your books are pretty nostalgic. But so that's interesting. But another thing is you talk a ton about ambition and desperation, and I think that's something you're constantly sort of seeking out on screen. But I do see that certainly in Class A, I feel like you were drawn to the characters in Class A, the men in Class A, for really a similar reason.
Yeah, I think that's true. I do think that subject matter wise, the books that I've written seem really different. But I do think that there is sort of a wheelhouse of things that I'm interested in, and that sort of sense of striving publicly, and then sort of like the weird personal aspect of what this sort of public desire to be something or have something is. It did feel in like none of the research process, none of the writing process felt the same as Class A was. But a lot of the things that interest me and a lot of the things that I was thinking about felt really, really familiar. And frankly, for Lord Fear too, that they're sort of, for whatever reason, these are the things that I think about.
Yeah. Can you talk more about how the experience of writing this was different or similar to your other books? Yeah.
I mean, it was like the sort of like the loosest thing I've ever written, and it was the thing that had no, like it does not have a lot of structure. Spoiler alert. Like there isn't much of an organization to it. It's like it feels like the most sort of purely essayistic thing that I've ever written, and that it's like I'm thinking about this, and I'm just gonna like keep thinking about this in this direction, and then like maybe at some point I'll stop. Like that, and I feel like for other books there has been some sort of anchor to it, right? That I have tried to maybe think about things and go into sort of like flights of fancy or whatever. But in Class A, it was centered around a season, and that it was like journalistic, on the ground research of this was the experience I had, this was what I saw, and then I could build off of it. And Lord Fear was this one inquiry into my brother, and it was this one period of interviewing people about him. And so the structure was there, and the main difference for me was this felt like the first time that I just sort of sat down and was like, there is no like on the ground scene to start from. There is no actual subject here other than me maybe being interested in this, and then just trying to let it go. So it felt like a total reverse in that way.
Yeah, and I would say it's probably your most conversational book. Do you think?
In that I'm directly having a conversation.
No, not even the you, yes. not even the second person. But I feel like you make constant references or frequent references to the act of writing. Like you're sort of revising yourself as you go. It does seem in that way the most essayistic.
Yeah, it's the most grad schooly one, which I feel like is a bit backwards. I should have gotten this out of my system. But yeah, it's writing about writing. It's musing.
And it's very studied. Like you use, sometimes you sort of like, at one point I think you say, okay, I wrote this down. You said, I think of AG in these moments. I do. Like you're bringing in these, like sort of to talk about brows, these highbrow sources to reinforce these ideas you have about quote unquote lowbrow culture.
Yeah, and that actually was something that you know, the conversational voice, I guess, that was like a really conscious thing. Like I really, really, really did not want to be the like writer dude writing in like a sort of above it way about low culture. Like I did not want to feel like I was a cultural critic, you know, looking at these people and like saying what they mean to the world. And so I think a lot of the style of the book kind of grew out of like pushing myself against that. And there is like a lot of research in it, and there is a lot of scholarship, but there was more originally, and the language felt more turgid originally. It felt like more like I was trying to perform my intelligence or whatever, and sort of be like, I deserve to be talking about this because look, I have, read these things. And then kind of the voice of the book ended up being like forcing myself to not do that, to sort of be like, if I'm going to be writing about these people who essentially their work is to put themselves out there, to be sort of bared in this way, to be judged, and to have people sort of look at them and say like, ugh, then like I should at least sort of meet them at the level of their performance, right? Like I didn't want to write from an above place.
Yeah. It does seem like to look and to be disgusted or to write it off as the sort of baseline easy response. Do you think your book is a defense of reality TV?
No. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think I think there's a part of it where I was actively trying to defend it more. Like there's a part in it where I think I'm sort of actually making arguments for why it's serious and it matters, and then that kind of falls apart. So I don't know. Like I don't know if it's a defense of reality TV. I think it's a defense of thinking seriously about reality TV, or sort of having the humility to think about why one can feel things in the face of reality TV. But I think that, I do think that part of like the narrative of the book is me sort of giving up on the like, this is brilliant and here's why. I don't know if it is, or I don't know if reality TV should be like defended or celebrated.
Yeah. I have a note here that says Trump, but I think we can just skip that part, right?
Is there like a dot?
No, just there's a line and then it says Trump. But it is a strange. I think we were both working on books, and then most writers were working on books, and then the election happened, and that work felt different or stupid or changed in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that other people in the room feel this way. Yeah, like the act of writing became loaded in a different way, and the act of sort of having anything to say about anything became loaded in a different way. And I think I maybe felt that acutely because I was writing about reality TV. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the book was sort of, certainly by the end, was trying to negotiate with that. But honestly, like I felt like a lot of the book, as I was writing, it was thinking like, why the fuck does this matter anyways? Like it just sort of felt like an outgrowth of things that I'd already been thinking about.
What are you working on now?
I'm working on a novel.
Do you want to tell us about that?
I'll have more to say hopefully soon. It's just it's about a mother and a son in Providence, where I live, who are sort of, through circumstances that they're not happy with, living back in this house together, in this sort of like weird gentrifying neighborhood, trying to like grow this garden and sustain themselves and not be a burden on the world, I guess. That's my elevator pitch so far, but hopefully it'll be a better one in like 6 months.
Pretty good.
Thanks.
We have a couple of minutes left, so maybe if anyone in the audience has any questions.
I'm just so curious about like the obsessions and preoccupations that you go into a deep dive on. Do you have anything that you've been sitting on for years that if time and money for travel permitted, you would investigate the way you've investigated some other subjects?
Oh, that's good. I don't know. Not in a way that it sort of popped up organically. Like for whatever reason, it's felt like that every book that I've written so far has felt kind of organic in like the curiosity about it. And so part of me like still has that itch to sort of like go and find that thing and do a deep dive into it, but I don't necessarily want to force it. So like reality TV sort of was that thing for me for a while, like even in like the back of my head kind of thing. Even when I was writing about other things, it was like, I do think it could be fun to do this, and I don't really have anything occupying my head like that at the moment. I'm out. I'm tapped.
Going back to Trump, maybe in a more direct way, how much do you think Trump's appearance for all those years as a reality television star had to do with him winning the election, or at least getting close to winning the election?
So, yeah, what was the true outcome of the election? So this is a shameless plug. I published a piece like last week on The Atlantic about Trump as the reality TV president. Look it up, it's online. And so I do, like, one thing that I kind of think is, and Emily Nussbaum in The New Yorker has written really well about this, but that there was like a really specific role that he was in on The Apprentice. So I think that sort of like calling him a reality TV president in a general sense isn't that helpful because it's sort of conflating everything. But in fact, I think his experience was way different than what most reality stars are. Like, he was literally the only person on reality TV who like could not be criticized. Like, his role on that show was the judge role, right? It would be like if Simon Cowell ran for parliament or something, or maybe he's a citizen, maybe he can be president. So everybody else is striving and insulting each other and being insulted, and that's sort of the drama of the show, and that's the world that they occupy, but they get to be the person who has already achieved the thing and is judging other people. And I think that really specific, really kind of easy reality TV role is maybe the thing that most directly seems to relate in terms of how people saw him, but that actually, you see the way that he sort of behaves when there's public criticism of him now, and it is as though he is a person who has never experienced that, right? Like I actually think that he's sort of I think Kim Kardashian would be much better equipped to deal with those particular stresses of her profession. I'll say that.
So one reason that I hate you is because you're so productive, yet you consume so much television.
You say that like those things aren't related.
Well, I'm just curious. I mean, for me, I find it really hard to do anything else while I watch TV, but I know certainly for Kristen, like I've seen that you just sort of passively consume it while being very productive on things that seem to take a lot of thought and rigor. And I'm curious to know, in the process of writing this book, whether you were kind of writing in real time while watching TV, or whether those two things remain discrete activities.
Yeah, they were discrete activities. And I will say that perhaps the book makes it seem as though they were less discreet than they really are. But I think, right, like I watch a lot of TV, although less at the moment, I think. But anyway, so that was a part of it. But I don't know if I could write. It's kind of like anything, right? Like when I was writing about baseball, I wasn't like watching games and writing scenes. Like, there had to be some sort of difference between the two of those. So I mean, I have a really hard time writing in my house. So I would watch a lot of reality TV and think about a lot of reality TV at home, but a great deal of at least the first draft of this book, there's a library in Providence like 2 miles away from my house, and on nice days I would walk there, so I was like far enough away from home to like not be able to do my usual bullshit and write. So in some ways, that the writing aspect and the watching TV or thinking about TV aspect felt like they sort of had to be explicitly separate for me to be productive.
You have a note at the end of the book about how you sort of mushed together timelines and made things, it was like a few years of life smushed into the book, right?
Probably more, yeah.
And so I'm curious, less about the reality TV aspects and more about the memoir aspects. There must have been a time where, like, you were living life while you were still writing about.
Yeah.
What was, like, you talk a little bit about sort of the self-consciousness of writing about your personal life while living it in the book. Like, can you talk a little bit more about what that was like?
It was very strange. I mean, I do. I think in a lot of ways, maybe books that come out now are just sort of like rip-offs of Maggie Nelson at this point. And I am a big Maggie Nelson fan. I was reading Maggie Nelson when I was thinking about this, and an interview of hers sort of talked about. She was like, I'm interested in the kind of life writing that is ongoing, that isn't sort of, if you think about a memoir, sort of like I'm looking back on this thing discreetly to analyze it, and that I sort of like the idea of this constant looping, right? That you were writing about it as you were thinking about it, and then you had to live with the consequences of you writing. It felt like a sort of totally different mindset than memoir, kind of. And yeah, I do think that the book a lot of the feel of the book for me had very much to do with that, right? With the fact that like the things that I was writing and thinking about were constantly being sort of like stoked or changed by continuing to live on. And then there's even like, there's a part in it where there's a scene where like my wife reads a draft of the book and doesn't like it and we talk about it, right? So that sort of keeps pushing it forward, which I don't recommend, but that felt sort of alive, I guess. I liked the idea that it didn't feel static because I didn't know what I was remembering that I was writing about. Like, it's not like I knew that I wanted to write about this. It was like I wouldn't know what I would be thinking about the next day. So it felt totally different.
So you mentioned that the genre is pretty mature at this point and that the formulas are very entrenched. But then I know you wrote about Queer Eye and how that was kind of the new Queer Eye and how that was kind of a breakthrough. Where do you think reality TV, like, what's the next stage of evolution of it?
I have no idea. That's a really good question. I think that reality TV people are trying to figure that out. That's a good question. Nice job. So a couple years ago, I wrote like a few different magazine pieces as essentially an excuse to do research for the book. And I wrote this one that was at a reality TV industry convention, was sort of like there where like people go and talk about what's next for the genre and pitch shows and whatever. And this was in 2016, I think. And they were like freaking out then about like, is this the end for the genre, right? Like this is a real anxiety that has been existing there. And at the time, their conversation was sort of about like, which was kind of ridiculous. So like, it's time to get back to authenticity. Like that's what everybody was saying over and over again, that like people are wise to it. Nobody wants the artifice anymore. They were really into this show that I had no interest in, that was like the Thoreau thing, where it was like literally they gave a guy a camera and sent him to the woods, and like without any like manipulation, you just sort of like watched him deal with being in the woods. So they were sort of on this trip about that it was going to come back to being something pure, I guess. That is not compelling to me. So I have no idea. I don't know if I can answer that. I think one thing that's interesting is that like it's weird that it even still exists and is still popular, because like you can get access to people's lives on Instagram or on YouTube or whatever, and then you can watch all manner of TV, all manner of scripted shows on Netflix. So like whatever lane that reality TV had, it seems like it shouldn't be there anymore. But people still watch a lot of it. So I that's not an answer to your question, but I don't know.
Wait, we probably have time for one more. Tony?
Oh, you should ask. They're both named Tony. Go for it. Yeah.
Two Tonys?
You watch a lot of television, so my question, I just learned that. You failed. Anyhow, you watch a lot of television. I was just wondering, when you write, do you see any difference writing for a print book or a digitalized book? And when you read, do you see any difference between the two? I guess more interesting when you write, if you feel it.
No, I mean, I don't read ebooks, weirdly, I guess. So yeah, like it wouldn't, I guess I don't, I have a hard time sort of thinking about what somebody's reading process will be when I'm writing generally. Like it just seems really, I'm amazed that people who can be that aware of what the experience of reading their stuff might be when they're writing, but I try to pretend like nothing exists and nobody will ever read it. Yeah, that's all. Yeah.
Can I do one more? You want
Sure, whatever.
So I have a question. I was thinking about what Kristen said about how things were different than the 1950s, right? It's not just like a different degree of fame, but like it's qualitatively different somehow. And I was thinking like, oh, well, what's the foundational myth of reality television? It's like Paris Hilton and Kim Kardashian sex tapes, right? Mm-hmm. That's how they got famous to begin with, and that's this like level of intimacy that you would have never seen in the 1950s or something. It would be hinted at in that way. So I was wondering if like you thought, well, first of all, like if you thought that like this intimacy, like anything that you have that's very intimate in a reality TV show is like perforce like inauthentic or unreal because of that, or if there's just like a weird layer of unreality on top of it. And also like if you think that it matters, if it is fundamentally different that we have seen like, you know, I have seen Kim Kardashian having sex, you know?
So is he. He's seen it too.
That's, I have. Yeah. Yeah. I do think that it's super strange. And I think the book is trying to think about that a lot. And one thing that I think is sort of a double bind that reality stars are put in, and you know, you mentioned Kim Kardashian and Paris Hilton in particular, often these reality stars are women, and it's a super, super gendered way of looking at reality TV and talking about reality TV, and specifically when it has to do with something like a sex tape, right? That you are expected to provide all of yourself and then reviled for being the person to do so. And that seems cruel and unwinnable. But then also there's sort of like a formal double bind of, it feels like when you're talking about reality stars, it's either they're written off as, well, they're not doing something. You know what I mean? They're just sort of like these passive people who are there. Or if they're doing something, like when people, so I guess you could say about Kim Kardashian, either she doesn't do anything, like, or if you're of the school of thought of people who think that she had a hand in making her sex tape famous and that she actively capitalized on it, which she says is the opposite, right? Like there's two schools of thought on that. But it's either she had this sex tape stolen, why do I care about this person who didn't do anything? Or Jesus Christ, she planned this whole thing. This sex tape is out there. She totally controlled this narrative, but then she's sort of reviled for that level of control because it feels dishonest. So either you're nothing or you're a liar. It seems to be sort of like the bind of the way that these stars are talked about. And I think that is really fucked up, but I do think that conversation is invited in the way these shows are. I don't think that that's not meant to be part of the appeal, is that you're constantly sort of being like, is this a mastermind thing? Are they making this happen? And then am I upset about the fact that they're bullshitting me? Or are you like, they're sort of passive people in their own lives? And I think it's really hard to know from person to person, but I do think that you're invited to think about just how much of them you've seen, just how honest it is, and just how much power they have or don't have, that you have to constantly think about that every time you look at Kim Kardashian, for better or worse.
Thanks everybody for coming. Everyone buy 2 copies of Lucas's book and eat some cake.
Thank you.